Well, welcome back, everybody, to the next installment of our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are continuing on now, I think, in like week 17 or 18, and we're closing in on halfway through the book. I guess the bonus for me, and maybe for y'all, is that you never have to wonder where we're going to be coming from on Wednesday nights, and I don't have to sit and worry about what I'm talking about the next week because we know we're plowing through Matthew. If you have not done so already, please take the time to sit down and read through the book of Matthew from beginning to end. I understand that it's got a little bit of length. I'm asking a little bit more of you than when I asked you to do the same thing with like Colossians or Philippians, but I think it's important that we take in these writings the way that they were originally meant to be read or heard by its original audience. In fact, one of the recommendations for understanding Scripture from people who kind of talk about how we as human beings take in information and stuff like that is to actually read it out loud. So I know the practice of reading out loud when you're by yourself may seem strange, but hearing, even in our own voice, the words hits us differently than just reading it with our eyes. So again, please, if you've not done so, do that because it helps us understand, I think, the books, the writings that we have better. As we continue on in the book of Matthew, we come to the very tail end of chapter 9 and all of chapter 10 tonight. It is a longer section. I think it's actually probably the longest section of Matthew that I've tried to tackle at once, and truth be told, we are not going to tackle all of it. I'm kind of going to hit the high points through there because the last thing I want is to talk to a camera in my office for 45 or 50 minutes. I'm sorry, I just have no desire to do it. And really to work through all of the passages in the scripture, it would take that and maybe then some. But you can read it yourself. I believe in your ability to do so. And then the other side of it is, this is all meant to be heard together. It was, looking at it, there was just no good place to break this down into 2 weeks worth of videos because we're supposed to take these chunks together. This is the second of the 5 kind of long discourses in Matthew from Jesus. It starts very similarly to the first one, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus recognizes a need in the people who are around him. And what I like about this passage, and maybe as a little bit of a teaser for you, is that Jesus sees this need and then turns to his followers to fill it. And that is an important starting point as we take a look at this passage for tonight. Before we do that, though, continuing on, in the tradition of having a quote for you, I apologize for... It starts kind of large here and then gets a little more squiggly and small down here. So again, I'll read it to you so that you don't miss it. This one comes from Richard Foster. It's like, I think it's the first lines in his book, Celebration of Discipline, which is all about developing spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices to help us grow. And he starts his book by recognizing that there are challenges to genuine discipleship. And since what we are going to be looking at in the verses tonight is genuine discipleship lived out, it seems like a pretty good starting point. So Dr. Foster wrote, superficiality is the curse of our age. The doctrine of instant satisfaction is a primary spiritual problem. The desperate need for today is not for a greater number of intelligent people or of gifted people, but for deep people. And what he means by that, and he goes on to explain it in the book, is a deep people are a people who recognize what is genuinely necessary in life and in faith and pursue that. Superficiality takes us away from that. And I think recognizing the superficial in us helps us navigate through our own hesitations to following the gospel more fully. So that's our starting point for this evening. We are in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 42 tonight, and it really falls into 2 simple sections. The first that we will look at is an invitation to participation in the kingdom of heaven. So in verse 35 of chapter 9, Jesus traveled through all the towns and villages of that area, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news of the kingdom, and he healed every kind of disease and illness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like a sheep without a shepherd, which is nearly a dead-on quote from Matthew chapter 4. And then he says to his disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few, so pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest, and ask him to send more workers into his field." So here's our starting point for the discourse. Jesus sees a crowd. And the thing that moves Jesus is compassion. When he saw the crowd, he had compassion on them. So divine compassion, the compassion of God, leads to divine action, the action of God. And so Jesus sees the crowd, he has compassion on them, and then he turns and looks at his disciples and says, pray for workers. Pray for God to send workers into the fields. And then Jesus sends them. That's essentially the first part of verse 10, where we get a list of the 12 apostles, and we could talk for a while about that, and maybe I should carve out a little bit of time just to talk about what apostle means in the Gospel of Matthew and how that designation shows up in the Bible moving forward. But tonight is not the night, or this video is not the time for that. I'll try to circle back around and do that one later. But we get a list of the names. Matthew throws it in there. It seems a little late because at this point we've only gotten 4 call stories: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Those are the ones who we know. And then suddenly there are 12. But my assumption is that Matthew doesn't really need to list out the 12 before then, and doesn't really need to list it here, because the early church community would have known these names. These would have been, and in some cases, individuals, but very likely names that were recognizable to them. Again, I believe that Matthew's community is made up of people who were, Jewish men and women who become followers of Jesus, who are in Palestine, maybe even in Jerusalem, where the early church gets started, who leave that area because of the Jewish revolt and the war with the Romans in 68 to 70, before the destruction of Jerusalem. Remembering in Mark that Jesus' instruction to his disciples is to not be revolutionaries who fight to the death, but instead flee to the hills when the mountains start. Flee to the mountains when the battle starts. I think this community probably has deep ties to the disciples in some way or another. But here we get a list of the 12, and then this in verse 5, Jesus sent out the 12 with these instructions. And so again, Jesus sees a need, he tells them to pray for God to send workers, and then he sends them. I read a story this week about somebody who would get up each morning and pray that God would send people to be his hands and feet in the world. And then he left his house looking for opportunities to serve, whether that was a person on the corner or a volunteer opportunity in the community. And then he would go home and thank God for sending someone. And that sounds like a strange practice, but it recognizes our role in carrying out the mission and work of God, to be the hands and feet, the physical presence of the kingdom of God in our world today. And a lot of what we're about to talk about very much channels that whole concept and that idea. And it's interesting that in Matthew chapter 10, we're about to read, Jesus is emphatic in verse 5, don't go to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans, but only to the people of Israel. And that's interesting for a number of reasons, not the least of which, I think by this point in Matthew's gospel, we've definitely had Gentiles who have been under Jesus' influence in some form or another. We've got a healing of a Roman officer's servant. We've got some crossover that's already there, but Jesus here in 10 is direct. Go to the lost sheep of Israel. That is a phrase that we see over and over in the Old Testament. I think Micah comes to mind. Isaiah, I know, certainly uses that phrase. And that's this understanding that there are a people with a purpose, but no direction and no leadership, so they flounder. And so what Jesus sees in these lost sheep is a flock that can be gathered. Harvest feels like a bad word when you're talking about sheep, and I don't want to mix metaphors too much here, but Jesus sees work to be done and his disciples workers to do the work, and he has set the tone and the model. He has shown them how to do it, and then he sends them out to do the same. And the instructions that they get sound radical to us. Go and announce that the kingdom of heaven is near. Great, that makes perfect sense. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cure those with leprosy, cast out demons. And then the last one, we would separate from the first, but Jesus certainly doesn't. Give as freely as you have received. Don't take any money in your belts, no gold, no silver, no copper coins. Don't carry a traveler's bag with a change of clothes, sandals, or even a walking stick. Don't hesitate to accept hospitality, because those who work deserve to be fed. Whenever you enter a city or a village, search for a worthy person and stay in his home until you leave town. When you enter the home, give it your blessing. If it turns out to be a worthy home, let your blessing stand. If it does not, take it back. If any household or town refuses to welcome you or listen to your message, shake its dust off of your feet as you leave. I tell you the truth, the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah would be better off than such a town on Judgment Day. So one of the things that I kind of recognized as got ready for class tonight is that all of these instructions, I think, feel very odd to us 20 centuries removed from Jesus' sharing of these instructions. And some of it is just simple imagery, like the whole shaking the dust off of your feet thing just doesn't make sense to us because it's not something that has a cultural component in our world. But certainly would have made sense to Jesus' disciples. Also, the idea of traveling without money just seems wild, but that's because we fail to understand the very ingrained culture of hospitality that existed in the ancient world. Like, hospitality was something that you could count on, so much so that it was odd that Jesus didn't find hospitality in a Samaritan town, even though there's historic animosity between Jewish people and Samaritans. And even at that moment, the gospel notes that it was due specifically to where Jesus was headed, that hospitality was withheld. And if you can expect hospitality from your enemies in most cases, then you can probably manage to travel without carrying a whole lot with you. But there is an idea here that is important. One, in traveling in such a way, they kind of mimic Jesus. Jesus was very much reliant on the hospitality of others as he traveled. It's not like he was a trust fund child with a nice bankroll to allow him to tour the country in his Jesus-ified Sprinter van or something like that. Jesus was very much dependent on others and willing to put himself in that vulnerable position because doing so helped build community and provide opportunities. And so the disciples are, in some ways, supposed to do the same. Not having a walking stick means that you can't, defend yourself from angry dogs. And not having a change of clothes. Again, these things just seem different to us. But when we recognize that what they do is force a reliance on God, then maybe we can understand better the perspective that we're being given. Because we're going to come back in 30 verses to this idea where Jesus is suggesting a radical dependence. And essentially says that we can count on God for our provision of anything that we need. Some of that requires us to let go of the superficial nature of our desires. Are we willing to be content with less than what we want? Are we willing to recognize that the provision of God is enough? And do we trust that God can and use other people to bring that about for us? And those are really, really difficult questions for us in a culture where everything we could possibly imagine can be ordered from the device in our pocket. And now that we've hit the place where it can be delivered by drone, we've stepped into the next realm of absurdity. And what Jesus is essentially doing is pushing his disciples in the polar opposite direction and saying, God will provide. Your focus is the mission. Now get after it. Skipping down a little bit further, Jesus then connects what they're doing to what he has done. Students are not greater than their teachers, verse 24. Slaves are not greater than their masters. Students are to be like their teachers. Slaves like their masters. And since I, the master of the household, have been called the prince of demons, the members of my household will be called even worse names. But don't be afraid of those who threaten you. For the time is coming when everything that is covered will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. What I tell you now in the darkness, shout abroad when daybreak comes. What I whisper in your ear, shout from the housetops for all to hear. And then again, do not be afraid. Those who want to kill the body. You can hear echoes of what Jesus is saying now in the Sermon on the Mount. There's some repetition, some clarification. In fact, in the verses that follow the words "do not be afraid" at the beginning of 28, Jesus talks about sparrows and God's provision and hairs on the head, and like all of those ideas show back up again. And there is again this emphatic promise that God will be with them, that God will take care of them, but there is an expectation that they have to do some trusting along the way. Because at some point, saying, I trust that God will provide by making sure, while making sure that you've got everything you need for the next day, misses the point. And there are some deep tones of the Exodus in these passages. You remember the instructions to the people of Israel for collecting manna and then quail is to only take what they need for the day and trust that God will provide for tomorrow. And so there is some expectation that followers of God, in the vein of Jesus, will act the same way, trust in God's provision. It looks different. It's not manna from heaven. It's hospitality from a stranger, but the idea is still very much the same. And then we get a direct quotation of Micah chapter 7, where Jesus begins to talk about how disruptive and uncomfortable this type of radical faith is going to be to others in their circles, whether that's Jewish men and women in the synagogues or Gentile Roman rulers who exist in their area. And inevitably, conflicts will come about for those who follow Jesus. And I think this is maybe the final point that I really want to focus on before kind of wrapping up our video for tonight. Because what's happened for the Methian community in likely Syria is that they've come into conflict with the synagogue, something that they, earliest generations of Christians wouldn't have expected. If you are a follower of Jesus in the first decade or two of Christianity, after his resurrection, if you're following Jesus, you're not calling it Christianity. Jesus is the fulfillment of your hopes and dreams of the God of Abraham, the promise. And this is what God is now doing, and soon everyone around me will understand this the same way I do. But by the time Jerusalem is destroyed, and small pockets of Christianity have managed to run afoul of the Roman government, you now hit this point where Christians are feeling rejected both by their friends and family in the synagogues and by the power structure around them. And they're trying to figure out, one, if they have a home. And for some of them, the second part is this real? Or has God abandoned us? Or did I misunderstand? Or is this not what God is doing? And so the temptation to let go of the Jesus part of their faith and just return to synagogue life and, duck and cover is a real temptation, because that is at least familiar and comfortable and a place of belonging. Even the punishments that get talked about in one of the passages I skipped over back in like verses 16 through 20, are punishments directly related to like blasphemy in the temple and in the synagogues. And there was this real tension that existed there. And you can understand the temptation to return to the familiar when the path you've chosen does not turn out to be the path you expected it to be. And in some ways, Matthew is using this teaching of Jesus to turn around and remind his community that they should not be surprised, nor does the conflict, the punishment, the abuse that they're on the receiving end of, mean that God is not still faithful or that Jesus is not the way. And so we get these words in verses like 35 through 38. I have come to set man against father, daughter against mother, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. There's a joke to be made there. Your enemies will be right in your own household. And this is strong and it's stark, and Jesus is trying to help them understand the reality that or try to understand that suffering, that conflict is simply part of the reality of following of Jesus. And part of them shouldn't be surprised because Jesus walked that path. And that's, again, I think one of the points that Matthew is trying to make here when he talks about students and teachers. Why on earth would the student expect to be treated any different than the teacher? Why would you expect that Jesus would be crucified, but you would somehow walk on a cloud of pillows? And in modernity, for us, much of what this has looked like has been a general assumption that persecution is not really something we have to face, or when we're slightly inconvenienced, we call it persecution, which is even more absurd. Or when people disagree with us, we call it persecution, which is not persecution. What is being talked about here is genuine persecution. And I think there are pockets of Christianity in every age who would have completely understood this passage in a way that evades us a little bit. But Jesus uses those conversations about conflict, even inside the family structure, to circle back around to, if you love your father or mother more than you love me, you're not worthy of being my disciple. Or if you love your son or daughter more than me, you are not worthy of being mine. If you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of being mine. If you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for me, you will find it. It's just another one of those stark sayings where Jesus is not saying abandon your children. What Jesus is saying is set your priorities. Now, he does so in a very harsh way because that's one of those teaching methods that helps make the point. But Jesus wants his followers to know that if their conflict is between following him and keeping brother-in-law happy, or following Jesus or keeping your parents happy, then there's a right choice and a wrong choice. And when it comes down to it, understanding the place that God deserves in our life is an important act of faith. And once we understand that, then we can carry out all the other important acts of faith that involve leaving behind our comfort, our expectations. All right. The last little bit of this evening, I'll look just at verses 40 through 42, because what Jesus is doing is sending. And he closes up kind of by talking about the value of their mission. Anyone who receives you receives me, and anyone who receives me receives the Father who sent me. So you are doing God's work. If you receive a prophet as one who speaks for God, you will be given the same reward as the prophet. And if you receive righteous people because of their righteousness, you will be given a reward like theirs. And not to be confused that it's only about big things. But 42 closes us out with this little note, and if you give even a cup of cold water to one of the least of my followers, you will surely be rewarded. There is goodness in carrying out the mission of God in really small, compassionate ways. It's not about big acts or productions. It is about the day-to-day life of a person of faith. And Jesus sends the 12 out to go do as he did. The nature of the sending to do as Jesus did hasn't changed. What it looks like might, but the fact that we are sent to be sermons on 2 feet, to be images of Jesus for the community around us to see, that's the exact same. And an important reminder to us that we are to live out this sort of radical obedience and radical reliance on God. And sometimes that means letting go of the superficiality that we so often buy into. And maybe that's a pretty good starting point. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wind down this video. We will pick up in Matthew chapter 11 next week. Glad you were with us. Catch you in the next video.